Everyone thinks the World Bank and IMF were built to help poor nations develop. The real story is far messier, and it starts with one man's fear of another depression. The official narrative is clean. After World War II, the Allies gathered at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and designed two institutions to prevent economic chaos. The World Bank would lend for development. The IMF would stabilize currencies. Problem solved, democracy preserved, growth for all. Sounds like a post-war Christmas carol, and for decades that's exactly how it was taught in economics textbooks. But here's what got left out of the school version. The US and Britain had spent 5 years fighting a war that nearly bankrupted both. The British Empire was crumbling. American planners knew what was coming, a power vacuum. The Bretton Woods Conference wasn't altruism, it was architecture, strategic architecture. Harry Dexter White, the American negotiator, and John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, sat across from each other with a single shared terror, another Great Depression. Both had lived through the 1930s. Both knew what mass unemployment and deflation did to democracies. Fascism rose in the wreckage, so they built institutions designed to prevent that outcome, but the design favored whoever held the most gold and voting power. Guess who that was? The World Bank began lending to Europe, Marshall Plan adjacent work, rebuilding allies. The IMF managed currency crises. For 20 years it worked, but the system had an expiration date built in. By the 1970s, the US couldn't back the dollar with gold anymore. The fixed exchange rates collapsed. The institutions survived, but their actual purpose shifted. Nobody announced it. They just quietly evolved into something else. That something else was structural adjustment. Developing nations hit a debt crisis. The IMF arrived with a prescription: cut government spending, privatize state industries, open your markets. Sounds neutral, sounds technical. But the effect was to lock poorer nations into economic models that benefited creditor nations and multinational corporations. The incentive structure was clear if you looked at who got paid. The IMF didn't invent this logic, it inherited it, but it enforced it. Thailand, Indonesia, Argentina, Ecuador. When crisis hit, the IMF's terms often made things worse before they got better. Unemployment spiked, public services contracted, local industries couldn't compete with foreign competitors, yet the debt servicing requirements stayed the same. The math was never really about development. It was about repayment and market access. Today, the World Bank and IMF claim to have learned. They talk about poverty reduction and climate finance, and some of that work is real. But the underlying structure, voting shares weighted by economic power, loan conditions that favor market liberalization, the assumption that debt repayment trumps human welfare remains. The institutions evolved, the incentives didn't. Understanding the World Bank and IMF isn't about blaming individuals. It's about seeing how institutions embed the interests of their founders into their DNA. They were designed to prevent another depression in the wealthy West. In that goal, they succeeded. Whether they've served development equally well is a question worth asking, and the answer depends heavily on which nation's ledger you're reading. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe for weekly breakdowns of the financial architecture that shapes global power, because geoeconomics never stops moving. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.